A black man helps a lost disabled boy in the rain. The next morning, he receives a mysterious phone call, marking the moment his life will change forever. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories your way. Thank you. Gene Hackman muttered to himself as he wiped down the counter of Starlit Diner for what felt like the 100th time. It was a slow night, just a few late-night regulars hunched over their coffee cups, waiting out the storm. Outside, the neon sign flickered against the wet pavement, casting red and yellow reflections into the puddles pooling along the sidewalk. Then he saw him, a boy, alone, sitting beneath the awning of the shuttered grocery store across the street, his small frame barely visible in the dim glow of the street lamp. He was slumped in a wheelchair, rain dripping from his tousled brown hair, his thin arms wrapped around himself in a feeble attempt to keep warm. Gene felt something twist inside his chest. He glanced at the clock, 11:15 p.m. No one should be sitting out in this storm, let alone a kid in a wheelchair. "Hey, Ellen," he called over his shoulder to the manager counting bills at the register. "You mind if I step out for a minute?" Ellen didn't even look up. "Make it quick, Hackman. We're closing soon." Gene didn't hesitate. He grabbed a spare towel from under the counter and pushed the door open, stepping into the cold night. The rain was sharp against his skin, soaking through his uniform in seconds. The kid didn't even flinch. "Hey, bud," Gene said, keeping his voice low, gentle. "You all right?" The boy's head lifted slightly, and for the first time Gene saw his eyes, pale blue, wide, guarded. "I'm waiting for my dad," the boy said. His voice was steady, but there was a hesitation there, a flicker of doubt that Gene didn't miss. Gene scanned the empty street. No cars, no movement. Just the distant hum of the city and the relentless drumming of rain. "How long you been waiting?" The boy swallowed. "I don't know. Maybe an hour?" "An hour? Out here?" Gene clenched his jaw. "What's your name, kid?" "Declan." "Well, Declan," Gene crouched to his level, holding the towel out. "I got hot chocolate inside. Best in town. You're welcome to wait for your dad in the diner where it's warm." Declan hesitated. I can't just go with a stranger." Gene huffed a soft laugh. "Smart kid. My name's Gene Hackman. Been working at Starlit for 3 years. You can see the diner from here, and I promise you, Ellen over there?" He jerked his thumb toward the window. "She'd kill me if I tried anything funny." The boy glanced toward the diner. He must have realized Gene wasn't going to give up, because after a long pause, he gave a small nod. Gene smiled. "All right then, let's get you inside." With careful hands, he gripped the handles of Declan's wheelchair, shielding the boy with his own body as he maneuvered him across the rain-slick street. What neither of them noticed was the black luxury car parked at the end of the block. Inside, Alexander Rehead, a man known more for his ruthless business strategies than his parenting skills, watched in silence. His steel-gray eyes followed the soaked figure of Gene Hackman as he ushered his son into the warm glow of the diner. His fingers tapped against the leather steering wheel. "Sir," came a voice through the speakerphone. It was Victoria Parker, his assistant. "I'm running late," Alexander said flatly. "Send someone to pick up Declan." A pause. Then, understood. Alexander didn't move. He kept watching. This was unexpected. Declan wasn't a child easily won over. He had a way of keeping his distance, of sizing people up before letting them in. Yet here he was, allowing a stranger to push him across the street, trusting him enough to follow him into a cheap diner. Alexander narrowed his eyes. Who the hell was Gene Hackman? Inside, Declan sat at the counter, his small hands wrapped around a steaming mug of hot chocolate. Gene had thrown a clean towel over his shoulders, and the boy was starting to relax, the tension in his frame easing with each sip. "My dad's just busy," Declan murmured after a moment, almost like he was trying to convince himself. Sometimes he forgets the time. Jean studied him. The kid's clothes were expensive. Tailored jacket, leather shoes, a watch that looked like it cost more than Jean's rent. But his fingers were rough, calloused. He used his wheelchair like it was an extension of himself, maneuvering it easily, with practiced familiarity. "How long you been using the chair?" Jean asked. Declan glanced up, surprised at the question. Most people didn't ask. Most people just stared. "Since I was 5. Jean nodded, as if the answer made all the sense in the world. "Well, I gotta say, you handle it like a pro." Declan's lips twitched, just barely. "Thanks." The door swung open, letting in a sharp gust of wind. A woman in a crisp suit stepped inside, her sharp heels clicking against the tile. Not a strand of her dark hair was out of place despite the storm outside. Declan stiffened. "Mrs. Parker." The woman gave him a professional nod. "Your father sent me to pick you up." Jean frowned. "Your dad ain't coming himself?" Mrs. Parker turned her cool gaze on him, assessing. "Mr. Rehead has important business matters to attend to." She slid a sleek business card across the counter. "You've been very kind, but we'll take it from here." Declan hesitated. He looked at Jean, then back at Mrs. Parker. Jean knelt beside him, adjusting the towel. "You take care all right, kid?" Declan's grip on the mug tightened. Then, almost too quiet to hear, he said, "This was the best hot chocolate I've ever had." A small thing, but something about the way he said it stuck with Jean. As Mrs. Parker wheeled Declan toward the door, Jean watched the boy disappear into the storm. He didn't know why, but his gut told him this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The phone rang just as Gene Hackman was pouring himself a cup of coffee. It cut through the early morning quiet, sharp and unexpected, setting his nerves on edge. He frowned at the unfamiliar number before answering, wiping his free hand on his apron. "Hackman." A woman's voice, cool and precise, came through the line. "Mr. Hackman, this is Victoria Parker." Gene straightened at the name. He remembered her well, polished, detached, the kind of person who always looked like they were in control. Last night, she had wheeled Declan out of the diner without a second glance in his direction. Now she was calling him. He glanced at the clock. "Too early for pleasantries." "Yeah," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" There was a pause, but not the hesitant kind. It was the pause of someone calculating their next move. "Mr. Rehead would like to meet with you today at his office. 2 o'clock sharp." Gene frowned, already uneasy. "For what?" "He will discuss that with you in person." Gene exhaled slowly. A billionaire like Alexander Rehead didn't summon a diner worker to his office for a casual chat. Whatever this was, it wasn't small. "Look, lady, I don't know what this is about, but it's not a request." The words landed heavy. Gene's grip on the phone tightened, but before he could say another word, she added, "A car will be outside your apartment at 1:30. Don't be late." The line went dead. Gene stared at the phone, an uneasy feeling curling in his gut. He wasn't sure what game Alexander Rehead was playing, but he had a bad feeling he was about to find out. The headquarters of Rehead and Navastians was nothing like Gene's world. The building loomed over the city, glass and steel stretching toward the sky, its entrance flanked by uniformed security. Inside, everything gleamed. The floors, the walls, even the air seemed polished, untouched by the chaos of everyday life. The kind of place that smelled like money and power. A receptionist with an immaculate smile directed him toward the elevator without asking questions, like she had been expecting him. When the doors slid open on the 50th floor, Victoria Parker was already waiting. "This way." She led him down a long hallway, her heels clicking against the marble. The air was thick with silence, the kind that made a man feel like he didn't belong. At the end of the corridor, she pushed open a pair of heavy wooden doors. Inside, Alexander Rehead sat behind a desk larger than Gene's entire kitchen. He didn't look up immediately. his focus on the papers spread before him. The room, like the man himself, was coldly impressive. Dark wood, leather chairs, an entire wall of glass overlooking the city, a space built to remind people of power. Rehead finally lifted his gaze, assessing Jean with the kind of look that stripped a man down to his bones. "Sit." Jean didn't move. "Look, Mr. Rehead, I don't know what this is about, but I know everything about you, Mr. Hackman." The statement hung in the air, cutting through whatever Jean had been about to say. Rehead picked up a folder, flipping it open with practiced ease. "Jean Hackman, 34, grew up in Newark, left college in your third year, financial difficulties. Been working at Starlit Diner for the past 3 years. He glanced up, expression unreadable. "That sound about right?" Jean kept his face neutral, but something about hearing his life laid out like a business report sent a prickle down his spine. "I don't see how that's any of your business." Rehead ignored the comment. "Last night, you saw my son alone in the rain. You didn't walk past him. You didn't ignore him. That tells me something about you." Jean crossed his arms. "And what's that?" "That you see people." The answer was so simple, so deliberate, that it threw Jean off balance. Rehead leaned back, studying him like a man deciding whether a gamble was worth the risk. "I need someone like that." Jean narrowed his eyes. "Someone like what?" "A man who understands what it means to struggle," Rehead said calmly. "A man who doesn't turn away when he sees someone in need. A man I can trust." Jean let out a rough chuckle, shaking his head. "Trust? You don't even know me." Rehead didn't blink. "You helped my son when no one else did. That's enough." The weight of those words settled between them, and Jean suddenly had the unsettling feeling that this meeting had nothing to do with gratitude. There was something else at play here, something bigger than a simple thank you. Then Rehead said, "I'm offering you a job." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Jean blinked. "Excuse me?" "Director of the Rehead Foundation, salary in the 6 figures, full benefits." Jean felt like the floor had shifted under him. "You're joking." Rehead remained impassive. "I don't joke." Jean shook his head, trying to make sense of it. "I'm a diner worker. I don't have the experience for something like that." "I have plenty of people with experience," Rehead replied. "What I don't have is someone who sees people the way you do." Jean rubbed a hand over his face. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. "Why me?" For the first time, something in Rehead's expression softened. "My son doesn't trust easily." Jean stilled. "He barely speaks to his tutors, ignores most of the staff. Yet last night, he let you take him inside, let you talk to him. That is not something I've seen in a very long time." There it was. This was about Declan. Rehead closed the folder, voice steady. "So I'm offering you a choice." Jean exhaled. "What choice?" "You can walk out that door and go back to your life. Keep scraping by. Keep wondering if you could have done more." Rehead's tone was even, measured. "Or, you can take this job, help change lives, help Declan." The room was too quiet. The weight of the moment pressed down on Jean, the reality of what was in front of him settling deep in his gut. This was too big, too unreal. He didn't belong in this world, and he sure as hell didn't trust a billionaire who thought he could buy whatever he wanted. But then he thought about Declan, alone in the rain, waiting for a father who hadn't come, clutching that mug of hot chocolate like it was the only thing keeping him warm. Jean had seen too many kids like that before. Maybe this was his chance to actually do something. He took a breath, steadying himself. Then, finally, he looked Alexander Rehead in the eye. "When do I start?" Jean stepped into the Rehead and Navastian's headquarters for his first day, already feeling the weight of eyes on him. The hush that settled when he walked past, the way people exchanged glances, the subtle shift in body language, it was all too familiar. He wasn't one of them. The suits, the polished shoes, the air of effortless confidence. These people had never spent a day worrying about rent, never scraped by on tips, Never wondered if their last gallon of gas would get them through the week. And Gene? He stuck out like a sore damn thumb. It wasn't just the way he dressed, though his off-the-rack blazer and second-hand dress shoes probably weren't doing him any favors. It was who he was. A black man in a world of old money, private schools, and country club handshakes. Hackman. The voice was smooth, edged with something just a little too sharp. James Sullivan, Vice President. Gene turned to face him. The man was tall, well-groomed, the kind of guy who looked like he'd been born wearing a suit. His smile was all teeth, no warmth. "Didn't realize we were bringing in charity cases," Sullivan said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Alexander must be feeling sentimental." Gene met his gaze, steady. He'd dealt with men like Sullivan before, the kind that smiled while making sure the doors stayed locked behind them. "If you got something to say, go ahead and say it," Gene said evenly. Sullivan's smirk widened. "Just wondering how long you'll last before you realize this isn't your kind of place." He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough. "Men like you don't get handed opportunities like this, Hackman. You must be real special." Gene clenched his jaw. Sullivan was testing him, waiting for a reaction. Gene had learned a long time ago that men like this wanted you to break first. So, he didn't give him the satisfaction. He exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. "Guess we'll find out, won't we?" Sullivan chuckled, shaking his head as he walked off. Gene knew this wasn't the last time he'd have to deal with him. Declan was waiting in his father's office when Gene walked in later that afternoon. The boy sat in his wheelchair, a thick book resting on his lap, but his face lit up the moment he saw Gene. "You survived your first day," Declan said with a grin. Gene snorted. "Barely." Declan gestured at the chair across from him. "Take a seat. You look like you need it." Gene lowered himself down, exhaling. "Been a long one, kid." Declan tilted his head, eyes sharp in a way that reminded Gene too much of his father. "Sullivan?" Gene raised an eyebrow. "What do you know about Sullivan?" Declan shrugged. "He's always trying to get rid of people my dad trusts. Thinks he should be the one running the company." Gene wasn't surprised. A guy like Sullivan wasn't the type to be happy playing second. Declan studied him. "He got under your skin?" Gene scoffed. "Nah, he tried though." The boy smiled, like he knew exactly what that meant. Declan flipped the book in his lap closed. A book on astrophysics. Gene glanced at the title. "That what you're into?" Declan's expression changed, excitement, then hesitation. He ran his fingers along the book's spine. "I want to be an astrophysicist," he admitted. "But my dad wants me to take over the company." Gene leaned back, nodding slowly. "That what you want?" Declan hesitated, then shook his head. "Not really." Gene could hear the conflict in his voice, the weight of expectations pressing down on him. He knew that feeling well. "Then don't let anyone tell you what you gotta be," Gene said. "Not even your old man." Declan looked at him, surprise flickering across his face. "You'd say that to him?" Gene smirked. "Probably not in those words." Declan laughed, shaking his head. The next morning, Gene walked into a conference room filled with board members, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Sullivan was there, sitting near the head of the table, arms crossed over his chest. Gene ignored him and focused on what he came to do. He took a breath and started laying out his plan, a foundation that would provide real resources for kids with disabilities from underprivileged areas, scholarships, medical aid, actual life-changing programs. He barely made it past the first slide before Sullivan leaned back in his chair with a scoff. "This is a waste of company resources," he said. "We're not a charity." Gene didn't flinch. "We're a billion-dollar company. A few million in the right places changes lives." Sullivan's lip curled. "That's not how business works." Gene met his gaze, unshaken. "Then maybe business needs to change." A murmur went through the room. Sullivan's expression darkened. I don't see why we should invest in something that won't offer a return. Jean leaned forward. It does. Companies that invest in social responsibility see an average increase in market valuation by 28%. That's a fact. Sullivan's jaw tightened. For a second, Jean thought no one was going to say anything. Then Alexander Rehead, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. The Foundation moves forward. The finality in his tone shut down any further debate. Sullivan's fists clenched. He knew he had lost, for now. Jean left the room knowing one thing for certain. He had just made an enemy. Jean knew trouble was coming before it arrived. It was the way Sullivan had clenched his fists, the way the other board members had exchanged looks before leaving the room. He'd seen that kind of tension before, the kind that meant somebody was about to play dirty. He just didn't expect it to happen so soon. That night, when he got home, there was an envelope waiting for him. No return address, just his name, written in sharp, precise letters. Jean stood in the dim glow of his apartment, turning the envelope over in his hands before sliding a finger under the seal. A single sheet of paper slipped out, along with a handful of photographs. He didn't need to look at them to know something was wrong, but he did anyway. Him and Declan at the park. Him pushing Declan's wheelchair down the sidewalk. The two of them at the cafe. The boy laughing over a hot chocolate. Somebody had been watching. His stomach tightened as he read the note. We know who you are. Don't think you can fool everyone. Jean let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't just a warning. It was a message. Someone wanted him to know they were keeping tabs on him, that they had eyes on Declan too. His first thought was Sullivan. The man had made it clear that he wanted Jean gone, but this felt different. This wasn't about boardroom politics. This was personal. Jean set the photos down carefully, his mind already racing. Who else had something to lose if he stayed? The answer came sooner than expected. The next morning, he walked into his office at the Foundation to find Victoria Parker standing at his desk, flipping through some of his files. For a second, she didn't even bother pretending to be surprised. Jean shut the door behind him, his voice even. Didn't take you for the snooping type. Victoria didn't look up. I had to make sure. Jean crossed his arms. Make sure of what? She exhaled, finally setting the papers down. That you weren't a threat. Jean's jaw tightened. He already didn't trust her, but now it was clear she was working against him. You're working for somebody else, he said. It wasn't a question. Victoria held his gaze, her face unreadable. Then, finally, she said, Junie. Jean had heard the name before, but only in passing. Junie Rehead, Alexander's ex-wife, Declan's mother. A woman who had disappeared from the picture years ago, but still carried the kind of influence that could make problems vanish. Jean's voice was careful. She wants Declan back. Victoria nodded, and she'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. Jean sat down, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He wasn't stupid. He knew family court cases could get ugly, but this was something else entirely. So what's the plan? He asked. Smear Alexander? Make him look like a bad father? Victoria hesitated. That was enough of an answer. Jean scoffed. And I'm guessing she wants me to help. Victoria finally sat down across from him. She knows you have influence over Declan, that he trusts you. If you testify against Alexander, tell the court that he's neglectful, that Declan is better off with her. Jean let out a low laugh, shaking his head. Not happening. She'll make it worth your while. I don't give a damn about the money, Jean said sharply. That kid doesn't need to be caught in the middle of whatever game she's playing. Victoria's gaze darkened. Then you should watch your back. Jean held her stare. Is that a threat? She stood. A warning. That afternoon, Jean got a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was female, smooth as silk but sharp as a blade. Mr. Hackman, Junie Rehead said. I think it's time we met. She chose a public place. That alone told Jean she wasn't looking to cause a scene, at least not yet. He found her waiting for him at the edge of the city park, seated on a bench overlooking the lake. She was dressed impeccably, not a hair out of place, radiating the kind of effortless power that came with old money and good lawyers. Jean sat down beside her, keeping a careful distance. "You wanted to talk." Junie's smile was small, unreadable. "I want what's best for my son." Jean stayed quiet. She sighed as if she had expected his silence. "Declan belongs with me." Jean glanced at her. "You say that like you've been here." Junie's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "I made mistakes," she admitted. "But that doesn't mean I don't deserve another chance." Jean exhaled, his voice steady. "And what does this have to do with me?" Her smile returned, sharper this time. "You're close to him. He listens to you. If you help me, convince him that being with me is the right choice, I can make all of this very easy for you." Jean shook his head. Not interested. Junie's smile faded. "You should be." Jean stood. "I work for Declan, not for you." He had barely made it halfway across the park before his phone rang again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. It was Alexander's office. Jean answered, already bracing himself. "Mr. Hackman," the voice on the line said, "I'm calling to inform you that effective immediately, you are no longer permitted on company property." Jean stopped in his tracks. "Excuse me? I've been instructed to revoke your access to all Rehed and Navastian's facilities." Jean didn't need to ask who had given that order. Junie had made her move, and now if he wanted to protect Declan, he was going to have to fight back. Jean had been in fights before, not the kind with fists, but the kind where everything you worked for, everything you stood for, was on the line. He had fought for jobs, for respect, for survival. But this was different. This wasn't about him. This was about Declan. As he stood outside the towering glass doors of Rehed and Navastian's, security blocking his way, he could feel the shift. He was no longer an employee, no longer part of this world. He was an outsider again. The guards didn't need to say a word. Their stance told him enough. He had been erased. He turned on his heel, hands clenched in his coat pockets, and walked away, his mind already working through the next step. He wasn't going to sit back and let them take that kid. The rumors started fast. By noon, people were whispering. Jean had barely gotten through his first cup of coffee at a nearby diner when his phone started buzzing with messages. Some from people at the company, others from contacts he didn't even know had his number. "I heard they dug up something from your past. Sullivan's saying you lied about your background. People are saying you're dangerous." He let out a slow breath, setting his phone down. He had expected this. Junie was using every weapon she had. Sullivan, of course, wasted no time twisting the knife. By late afternoon, the man was on TV, standing in front of the Rehed and Navastian's building, flashing his best politician's smile. "We take the integrity of our leadership seriously," Sullivan said smoothly, looking directly into the camera. "Unfortunately, recent discoveries have led us to reevaluate certain staffing decisions. Our company has no place for deception or instability." Jean switched the TV off. He wasn't even surprised. But then his phone rang. Alexander. Jean picked up instantly. "Declan's gone." Jean's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean, gone?" Alexander's voice was clipped, controlled, but Jean could hear the panic beneath it. His security team lost sight of him an hour ago. No ransom note, no messages. He just disappeared. Jean pushed back from the table, already heading for the door. "It's Junie." "I know," Alexander said. "The question is, where the hell did she take him?" Jean didn't hesitate. "I'll find out." Junie didn't wait long before making her move. That evening, Jean's phone buzzed with an unknown number. He answered, already knowing who it would be. Junie's voice was smooth, calm, like they were old friends. "Mr. Hackman, I assume you've heard?" "Where is he?" "You'll see him soon," she assured him. "But we need to talk first." Gene forced himself to stay steady. Then talk. Not over the phone. Gene exhaled. Where? A pause. Then she said, The Astoria Hotel, room 1912, 30 minutes. The line went dead. Gene didn't waste time. When he arrived, the lobby was quiet, the kind of place where everything smelled like old money, the kind of place where problems disappeared if you paid enough. He rode the elevator up, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. Room 1912 was at the end. Junie was waiting. She looked the same as she had in the park, poised, perfectly composed, a woman who never lost control. She gestured toward the sitting area. Have a seat. Gene didn't move. Where's Declan? Junie sighed, as if his concern was a mild inconvenience. Safe, comfortable. Gene took a step forward. I'm not playing games, lady. She met his stare, unfazed. Neither am I. The air was thick with silence. Then she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Alexander is an absent father, Mr. Hackman. He doesn't understand Declan. He doesn't know what the boy needs. But you've seen it, haven't you? The loneliness? The frustration? Gene clenched his jaw. She continued, voice smooth as glass. If you testify that Alexander is an unfit father, that Declan would be better off with me, well, I can make all of your problems disappear. The rumors, the lies, they'll be gone by morning, your reputation restored. Your life back to normal. Gene stared at her, then let out a quiet laugh. Lady, you really don't know me, do you? Something in her expression flickered, just for a second. Then she sighed, reaching for a folder on the table. I was hoping you'd be reasonable. She slid it across the table. Gene opened it. Inside were pages of documents, photos, emails, evidence carefully arranged, meant to destroy him. You see, Junie said softly, there are so many ways to ruin a man. Gene set the folder down, meeting her gaze. That's supposed to scare me? She tilted her head slightly. It should. Gene exhaled, shaking his head. I'm not helping you. Junie leaned back, watching him. Then she smiled, just barely. Then I suppose we'll have to do this the hard way. Gene didn't waste another second. He turned, walking out the door, his pulse steady, his mind already working. He had gotten what he came for. Junie had confirmed Declan was in the hotel. Now all he had to do was get him out. He pulled out his phone, dialing the only person who could help. Alexander, he said quietly. I know where he is. This was zombie medicine. 20 minutes later, Gene and Alexander were moving through the hallways of the Astoria Hotel, their footsteps silent against the carpet. Room 1912 was still at the end. Alexander didn't hesitate. He pushed open the door. And there was Declan. Sitting on the edge of the bed, hands gripping his knees, his face pale but dry. The moment he saw his father, something in him broke. Dad. Alexander didn't say a word. He just crossed the room and pulled the boy into his arms. Junie, standing in the doorway, folded her arms. This won't end here. Gene met her gaze. I know. She smiled slightly. Good. As they left the hotel, Declan still clutching his father's hand, Gene knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Gene had expected retaliation. He just hadn't expected it to come this fast. By morning, the damage was already done. News outlets ran with the story like wildfire, every headline more damning than the last. Billionaire's neglect. Alexander Rehead's son left in the care of a stranger. Who is Gene Hackman? A hero or an opportunist? From diner worker to power player, the man trying to replace Alexander Rehead. The photographs were everywhere. Declan and Gene at the cafe, at the park, in the hotel lobby. The same pictures that had been used to threaten Gene before were now plastered across national news, twisted into something ugly. The morning news anchor delivered the report with the kind of measured concern that made the lie feel true. Sources say Alexander Rehead has left much of his son's care to an unvetted outsider. The boy's mother, Junie Rehead, has expressed concerns over the influence this man has on her child. Meanwhile, financial records suggest that Hackman has benefited greatly from his connection to the Rehead family. Could this be a case of manipulation? An attempt to secure wealth and status under the guise of mentorship? Gene shut the TV off, his stomach turning. Junie had lost the battle at the hotel, but she wasn't done fighting. She wasn't just coming for Alexander anymore. She was coming for him. His phone buzzed. It was a blocked number. He almost ignored it, but something told him to answer. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Yeah." A voice, disguised by static, said, "Check your email." Then the line went dead. Gene stared at the phone, his pulse ticking faster. His laptop was still open on the table. He clicked into his inbox. One new email. No sender. No subject. Just an attachment. His fingers hovered over the trackpad. This could be a trap. A setup. But something in his gut told him it wasn't. He clicked. A list of documents unfolded before him. Scanned contracts, wire transfers, emails dating back years. At first, none of it made sense. But then the pattern emerged. Junie's name, tied to offshore accounts. Large, unexplained withdrawals. The Rehead Foundation's name listed in places it shouldn't be. She had been siphoning money, laundering it through charities. This wasn't just bad press. This was criminal. Gene leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. Someone wanted him to have this. The question was, why now? Alexander's legal team was already in crisis mode when Gene arrived at the office. The conference room was packed, lawyers, PR executives, security specialists, everyone talking over each other, trying to contain the damage. Alexander sat at the head of the table, silent, his fingers steepled in front of him. Sullivan stood near the window, arms crossed, smirking. Gene didn't have to hear the conversation to know what was happening. They were looking for a scapegoat. As soon as he stepped inside, Sullivan's smirk widened. "Good of you to join us, Hackman," he said. "Though I'm not sure why you're here. You seem to be the problem, not the solution." Gene ignored him, turning to Alexander. "We need to talk. Now." Alexander nodded once. "Everyone out." Sullivan hesitated, but Alexander shot him a look that left no room for argument. The room cleared within seconds. When it was just the two of them, Gene placed his laptop on the table and spun it around. "You need to see this." Alexander scanned the documents, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair. "Where did you get this?" "Anonymous source," Alexander exhaled. "If this is real..." "It is," Gene cut in. "Junie's been funneling money through charities for years. She's built her case against you, but this buries her." A long silence stretched between them. Alexander's jaw tensed. "She won't go down without a fight." "She won't have a choice," Gene said. Before either of them could say another word, the door opened. Sullivan stepped back inside, arms folded. His smirk was gone. "Media's not letting up." Junie's team is already setting up interviews. Public opinion is swinging her way. And frankly, Alexander, this circus, it's bad for business. He glanced at Gene, eyes cold. And keeping him around, even worse. Gene had been expecting this. Sullivan had been waiting for his chance to get rid of him. Now he had the perfect excuse. Alexander was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Leave us, Sullivan." Sullivan hesitated. "I don't think..." "Now." Sullivan pressed his lips into a thin line, but obeyed. When the door clicked shut, Gene exhaled. "He's right." Alexander frowned. "About what?" "I'm a liability now," Gene said. "The more I stick around, the more she can use me against you." Alexander studied him. And what do you propose? I walk away, publicly. Make it clear I'm not part of this anymore. It takes some of the heat off you, off Declan. Makes it harder for her to paint this as some kind of conspiracy. Alexander didn't respond right away. Then, finally, he nodded. This doesn't mean I'm giving up, Jean said. I'm just changing tactics. Alexander gave him a long look. Then he said, If you need a way back in, you call me. Jean forced a small smile. I appreciate that. Jean didn't waste time. Junie had already played her hand, but he knew she wasn't done. Women like her never lost without trying to take everything down with them. She was powerful, ruthless, and well-connected. If he wanted to end this, he had to be just as relentless. He spent the next 3 days locked in his apartment, sifting through the documents that had landed in his lap. It was all there, buried under years of deception, falsified charity expenses, offshore accounts, legal settlements that had quietly disappeared. Junie hadn't just been dipping into the Rehead Foundation's funds. She had a history of using lawsuits to take what wasn't hers. One case stood out. A disgraced businessman, Henry Collings, who had been wiped off the financial map 5 years ago. The records suggested that Junie had orchestrated a fraudulent lawsuit against him, forcing him to settle for an outrageous sum. His entire fortune had vanished overnight, and she had walked away with everything. Jean exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This was about exposing who Junie really was. He just didn't expect Declan to show up at his door before he could act. The knock was soft, almost hesitant. When Jean opened the door, he found the boy sitting in his wheelchair, looking up at him with an expression Jean couldn't quite read. Declan didn't speak at first. He just studied Jean, as if trying to decide whether or not to say what was on his mind. Then, finally, he asked, Are you leaving for good? Jean crouched down, meeting his gaze. No, kid. Not if I can help it. Declan's fingers curled around the arms of his wheelchair. His voice was quiet when he said, Dad told me why you left, that you were trying to protect me. Jean nodded. That's right. The boy swallowed. But I don't want to lose you. Something in Jean's chest tightened. He had spent years keeping his distance from people, never letting himself get too close. But Declan? This kid had gotten past all of that. You won't, Jean promised. Declan searched his face, as if trying to decide if he could believe him. Then, with a small nod, he said, Okay. That was all he needed. Jean sent the documents to Alexander's legal team that same night. By morning, Junie's empire was crumbling. It started with an anonymous tip to the press. The leaked files spread like wildfire, headline after headline exposing the truth. Junie Rehead under investigation for financial fraud. Offshore accounts, stolen funds. Is this the real reason behind the custody battle? Ex-businessman speaks out. She destroyed me, and she's doing it again. Junie tried to fight back. She hired a crisis team, went on TV, calling it a smear campaign orchestrated by her ex-husband. But the damage was done. No amount of money could bury what had already been unleashed. Jean watched it unfold, knowing she wouldn't go down without trying to take him with her. Sure enough, she found him that evening. She was waiting for him outside his apartment, her expensive car parked at the curb, her sunglasses hiding the anger in her eyes. When Jean walked past her, she spoke without turning. You think you've won? Jean stopped. Junie exhaled, taking off her sunglasses. For the first time, she looked like a woman who had lost control. You have no idea what I'm capable of, she said. Jean didn't flinch. I think I do. Her lips curled, but there was no amusement in it. You could have taken my offer. You could have walked away clean. I don't sell out kids, Jean said. Junie's expression hardened. You ruined me. Jean shook his head. You did that yourself. For the first time, she had no response. After a long moment, she turned, stepping into her car without another word. The door slammed shut, and just like that, she was gone. The court decision came 2 weeks later. The judge ruled in Alexander's favor. Full custody. Junie didn't even show up for the final hearing. Afterward, as Gene stood outside the courthouse, Declan wheeled up beside him. The boy tilted his head. "So, does this mean you're coming back?" Gene smirked. "I guess that depends." Declan raised an eyebrow. "On what?" Gene glanced toward Alexander, who was watching them from a distance. "On whether your old man will take me back." Alexander approached, his hands in his pockets. "I already told you," he said. "If you ever need a way back in, you call me." Gene met his gaze. "Then consider this me calling." Alexander extended his hand. "Welcome back." Gene shook it. This time, when he walked through the doors of Rehed and Navastion's, he didn't feel like an outsider. He knew exactly what he had come back for. He spent the next few months building the foundation the way it should have been built from the start. No red tape, no corporate politics. Just real help for kids who needed it. And for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. Alexander had changed. The man who once only cared about the company now made time for his son. He showed up. He listened. One evening, as Gene passed Alexander's office, he overheard Declan talking about a new space program. "I want to be an astrophysicist," the boy said, "not a businessman." Gene expected Alexander to argue. Instead, after a long pause, the man simply said, "Then I'll make sure you get there." Gene smiled. He had done what he came to do. On the day of the foundation's official launch, Gene stood in front of the crowd, looking at how far they had all come. He glanced at Declan, then at Alexander. Then he said, "Sometimes, one small act of kindness can change a life." And he knew, not just Declan's life had changed. His had too. Junie left without fanfare. There was no press conference, no final attempt to salvage what was left of her reputation. Just a quiet departure, her name slowly fading from the headlines as the world moved on. Before she left, she met with Declan one last time. They sat together in the garden of the Rehed estate, the silence stretching between them like an ocean. Declan's fingers tapped against the armrest of his wheelchair, a nervous habit he hadn't quite outgrown. Junie watched him carefully, her face unreadable, her manicured hands folded neatly in her lap. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said finally. "I've made mistakes, more than I can count." Declan didn't look at her. "I thought winning meant keeping you with me. That if I could prove your father wasn't good enough, it would mean I was." She let out a quiet breath, something fragile slipping into her voice. "But I was wrong, about a lot of things." Declan turned his head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. Junie swallowed. "I want to do better." For a long moment, there was nothing but the distant sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. Then Declan nodded, just once. A small gesture, but enough. She reached out, hesitated, then gently rested a hand over his. "I love you," she whispered. Declan's voice was soft when he finally spoke. "I know." That was how they left things. Not perfect, not fully healed, but no longer broken beyond repair. She walked away, leaving behind the battles, the betrayals, and the past that had nearly destroyed them all. For the first time in a long time, she was no longer running toward something. She was simply leaving. Gene hadn't thought much about what came after. For months, his life had been about fighting, for Declan, for the foundation, for something bigger than himself. He hadn't stopped long enough to consider what it meant to finally have won. It hit him one evening, as he sat on the balcony of his apartment, looking out over the city. He wasn't alone, not anymore. There was a knock at the door, followed by the unmistakable hum of Declan's wheelchair moving across the floor. The boy rolled out onto the balcony, a notebook in his lap, his usual sharp eyes softer than usual. Gene raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Declan grinned. "A plan." Gene smirked. You already planning world domination, kid? Declan shrugged. Something like that. He hesitated, then said, It's for my project, a new space program that focuses on accessibility and astrophysics. There's not a lot of representation for people like me in the field. Gene felt something warm settle in his chest. That's a hell of a thing to fight for, he said. Declan nodded. Yeah, but I've got some good people in my corner. His meaning was clear. Gene leaned back in his chair, stretching out his legs. Guess you do. Declan hesitated again, something still on his mind. Gene? Yeah? The boy's voice was quiet. Do you ever think about family? Gene exhaled, tipping his head back against the chair. More than I used to. Declan studied him for a second. Then he nodded, as if satisfied with the answer. A few minutes later, Alexander stepped out onto the balcony, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. He handed one to Gene before sitting down in the chair across from him. They clinked glasses in silence, the weight of everything they'd been through lingering between them, unspoken but understood. Alexander glanced toward his son, watching as Declan scribbled in his notebook, completely lost in his world. He's gonna be something, Alexander murmured. Gene smirked. He already is. Alexander nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. Then he looked at Gene. I owe you, he said. Gene shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Alexander exhaled. No, I do. You didn't just help Declan. You helped me see things I spent too long ignoring. A pause. Then Alexander smirked. That being said, you're still gonna run the foundation. No backing out now. Gene chuckled. Figured as much. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the city in gold and amber, Gene realized something. He had spent so many years drifting, never staying anywhere long enough to feel like he belonged. But now, he wasn't just passing through anymore. He was home. The grand opening of the Rehead Foundation was more than just a ceremony. It was a statement, a declaration that things had changed. People from all walks of life showed up. Corporate executives, community leaders, families who had fought their own battles, children who finally had a place where they mattered. Gene stood at the front, looking out over the crowd. He saw Alexander, standing tall with his son at his side. He saw Declan, beaming as he spoke to a group of students, already shaping the future he had once doubted was possible. And then he saw himself. No longer a man on the outside looking in, not just a former diner worker, not just someone passing through. He took the microphone, cleared his throat, and let the words come naturally. Sometimes, Gene said, one small act of kindness can change a life. His eyes found Declan's. And sometimes, it can change more than one. As the audience applauded, as the weight of everything that had come before settled into something lighter, Gene smiled. This wasn't a perfect ending, but it was theirs, and that was enough. The story of Gene Hackman is more than just a tale of struggle and redemption. It is a testament to the power of kindness, resilience, and the impact one person can have on another's life. Gene starts as an outsider, a man who has spent his life on the margins, fighting to survive. He has no wealth, no influence, but what he does have is integrity and compassion, and when he chooses to help a lonely boy in the rain, he unknowingly sets off a chain of events that will forever change his own destiny. His journey is not easy. He faces discrimination, betrayal, and powerful enemies who seek to destroy him. Yet, through it all, he remains true to himself, refusing to be corrupted or bought. He fights not for power, but for something greater: family, justice, and the belief that every person deserves a chance. In the end, Gene doesn't just save Declan. He finds his own purpose. The story reminds us that family is not just about blood, but about the people who stand by us, believe in us, and fight for us. Even the smallest act of kindness can ripple outward, transforming lives in ways we never expect. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.